All right, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So I'm gonna, this is a little experiment of sorts, if you will. So I've actually usually over-prepared for conferences, and I usually prepare research that I've been working on for a long time. That is not the case today. So I'm basically gonna pull a couple of ideas from the course I'm currently teaching, try to combine them and see what happens. So I hope that you will bear with me and hopefully also think with me afterwards in the discussion. All right. So when I first received the invitation for this symposium back in January, I was actually a little bit skeptical about this notion of hope, which is foregrounded in the symposium titled The Art Museum as a Space of Hope. My initial thought was that hope is what we're left with when we are devoid of agency and possibility to act. Hopefulness, wishful thinking even. I have, however, come to realize that there's a bit more to it than that. And there are a couple of artists and theorists that sort of help guide my thinking a little bit. Recently, I was struck by this comment by artist Emma Talbot, who's currently part of an exhibition at the Central Museum in Utrecht. And she said, having hope is almost an act of rebellion these days. Another perspective that has resonated with me is that of authors Thijs Leister, Hanke Otte, and Pascal Gillen. Drawing on sociologist Manuel Castells, they argue that only hope can lead to action. Hope in the sense of positive energy and impetus to make a change as opposed to resigning oneself to negative feelings of discomfort or injustice, for example. I'll circle back to Leister, Otte, and Gillen in a moment, but before that, I would like to give a short account of where I stand and speak from, as the invitation encourages us to do. I've been an assistant professor at Utrecht University since October 2023. Before that, I was, as Birgit already mentioned, a practice-based curatorial postdoc fellow at Aarhus University, working closely with a contemporary art institution, Kunsthal Aarhus. I don't have that kind of relationship with an art institution in the Netherlands, at least not yet. And for obvious reasons, I'm also still in the process of getting to know the Dutch art scene. But I am paying attention, not least because I am co-teaching a course called Emerging and Transforming Cultural Institutions in the research master program, Media, Art and Performance Studies at Utrecht University. Emerging and Transforming Cultural Institutions was not the name of the course when my co-teacher and I took it over last year. Back then it was called Emerging and Transforming Media, Art and Performance. But we both felt that the program would benefit from a course that opened up the perspective a bit, looked beyond the art object and engaged with the frameworks or cultural institutions in which art is made public. The students were very much on board and the program coordinated too, fortunately. This shift in focus from objects to institutions resonates directly with a proclamation that artist Coco Fusco made a few years back. We need new institutions, not new art. Fusco made the statement in 2020 during COVID and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, but I believe it's still urgent today. And it's become a bit of a motto for the course. The Dutch art scene is an interesting context for this kind of perspective because art institutions are in fact both emerging and transforming in the Netherlands, which you could say in and of itself is sort of a reason to be hopeful. For example, last year we took the class to Kunstinstituut Melli in Rotterdam, formerly known as Kunstinstituut Witte de Wit, named after the street it's located on and its namesake, Witte de Wit, a 17th century naval officer serving in both the Dutch East and West India companies. The name change and other institutional transformations were introduced in response to an open letter to Witte de With by a group of artists and critics questioning what it means for a white institution to do critical work under the moniker Witte de With. And this year, in fact just a few weeks ago, we visited Base Camp for Tactical Imaginaries in Utrecht with the current cohort. Base Camp emerged after the art institution BAK, Basis for Aktuelle Kunst, after 25 years. Quite shockingly, was defunded by both state and municipality last year. Base Camp stands on the shoulders of BAK, occupies BAK's spaces on Parahost, and is in a legal sense still BAK. But it's also something else than BAK. It's a collectivization, an attempt to imagine differently how to live together confronting the urgencies of today. What I'll be presenting today draws on aspects of the Emerging and Transforming course. Specifically, I want to bring together two ideas from two texts that we have been reading as part of the course, namely the civil sequence, which is introduced in a chapter called Towards a Cultural Policy of Trust, the Dutch Approach from the Perspective of a Transnational Civil Domain. I promise you, it's more exciting than the title suggests. It's written by Leicester Otte and Gielen, who I already mentioned. And then parahosting, which is a concept described by Paul O'Neill and practiced by him at an institution he runs in Helsinki. And he has outlined his understanding of this concept in an article called How Institutions Think, Thinking Like a Parahost. I propose, as I already sort of previewed in my abstract, that the museum should become a parahost of civil sequences that address shared societal problems. So let's first take a look at the civil sequence, which in short is a process through which individual emotion can transform into collective action. Drawing on sociologist Manuel Castells, the premise is that all civil action is born from emotion. The civil sequence consists of a succession of processes. It begins with emotion, with the identification of a personal discomfort like outrage, anger, fear, or frustration. We may be feeling dissatisfied with the lack of benches in public space, or be experiencing stress and anxiety from our workload. Obviously, not every emotion will lead to civil action. We can opt for private or individual solution to the problem, for example, by seeing a therapist in the case of stress. In the case of the civil sequence, the idea is to identify an initial intuition or basic emotion in ourselves that cannot or should not be resolved in private. The second process, rationalization, is first of all self-rationalization. It's necessary to analyze our own feelings and perhaps point out possible causes. Self-rationalization is required to articulate an initial intuition or basic emotion, and therefore precedes communication, which is the third process. So sharing or perhaps clarifying of emotions with others. Civil action is only possible if we deprivatize our personal discomforts. In other words, the initial emotion must be recognized as a shared emotion. And in order to do so, we need to address a collective and generate public support. And finally, the skill of organizing is required to set the civil action in motion, and if necessary, keep it going in the long run. The civil sequence unfolds through three transitions. The first transition takes place at the emotional level, where what is initially a negative feeling of discomfort must be converted into a sense of positive energy, an impulse to do something. As I mentioned earlier, only hope can lead to action. The second transition takes place at the level of communication, so a transformation that can take place from the individual to the collective level, It is also only through communication that we can test or correct our emotions and find out whether they are shared in the first place. The third transition is from the private to the public sphere, where a personal issue, for example, being a stress-sensitive person, is not only translated into a collective problem, stressful working conditions, the cause of the problem or feeling of discomfort is also located in a broader social phenomenon. This is why the transition from the private to the public sphere also implies a politicization of the initial feeling. The civil sequence described by Leister, Otte, and Gielen is not in its conception connected to an existing institution or museum for that matter. On the contrary, the civil sequence could provide the scaffolding for an initiative that might in time institutionalize itself and become a more permanent structure. We're actually inviting students in the course to, in groups, dream of new institutions based on this model. So starting out with a personal feeling of discomfort and finding, well, I guess a common ground, if you will, and from that building an institutional idea. Yeah, so the civil sequence might actually lead to something that can institutionalize itself, or it might just exist temporarily, mobilizing a possible solution or remedy to the problem that ignited the civil sequence in the first place. However, no matter the scale or temporality of the initiative, initiating and sustaining such processes require a lot of dedication, skill, and knowledge. Leister, Otte, and Gielen argue that processes of self-rationalization and self-organization can diminish the emotions that initiated them in the first place. They write, having to find one's way in a maze of legal rules, being obliged to study political procedures, or having to follow the long and winding road through bureaucratic institutions in order to arrive at the right form of organization can make one lose the energy to go on. And they continue, the chances of a civil initiative succeeding and enduring therefore depend on finding the right balance between rationalizing and organizing on the one hand, and keeping up the energy that is obtained from the initial basic emotion on the other. So it is my suggestion that a museum can play a role in facilitating and supporting civil initiatives in their efforts, and that they may do so in the role of a parahost. So that's what I'll be briefly introducing you to now. So coined by Paul O'Neill, Artistic Director of the Art Institution Publics in Helsinki, parahosting is a practice of doing something other than, beside, outside, or auxiliary to, and operating at a distance from the main act of curating exhibitions. As a parahost, the art institution becomes a collaborative enabler who shares resources, space, time, knowledge, and funding with others, para-guests, who provide support for their curatorial ideas. In this way, parahosting introduces a mode of operation in which the institution relinquishes traditional forms of authorship and authority in favor of care, co-authorship, and support. Instead of commanding the narrative, parahosting foregrounds ethics of care and solidarity, encouraging the institution to function as a platform of support rather than a curatorial gatekeeper. There will, of course, always be some measure of gatekeeping. Decision-making will necessarily be involved, who becomes a para-guest. And even the website of Publics include a protocol describing the responsibilities of the para-host and the para-guest during collaborations. Hospitality is always conditional. But para-hosting still introduces, I think, an innovative institutional model that not only offers new forms of usership, but also might just reconfigure the institution itself. O'Neill connects the notion of parahosting with anthropologist Mary Douglas's institutional theory in the book How Institutions Think from 1986. Douglas here argues that institutions condition how people think and relate to one another. O'Neill expands on this idea by suggesting that institutions can be made to think otherwise and in turn to operate differently by adopting collaborative and care-based frameworks such as parahosting. At Publics in Helsinki, parahosting takes the form of an ongoing program strand that unfolds through residencies, talks, performances, and discursive gatherings. As I've already mentioned, what I'm suggesting here is that the museum should become a parahost of civil sequences that address shared societal problems. At first glance, this kind of undertaking might not seem to fall within the purview of a museum, but I would argue that it does, especially if the museum is a design museum, which Trapholt also is. Because if we consider design not just as objects, but also as a problem-solving method, it would be particularly suitable for a design museum to take on this role. But I gotta say, after listening to Alistair's presentation, I think I'm also just fine with saying that this could also definitely be something for art museums to take on. Yeah. So bringing together the ideas of the civil sequence and parahosting in the design museum or in the art museum doesn't just instigate hope, although that is a necessary and important step. It offers a path for effective, useful, and collaborative action. While my example from earlier, the lack of benches in public space, is most likely a solvable problem, there are certainly also shared emotions pertaining to problems so complex and far-reaching that actual solutions seem far beyond the reach of civil action. But that does not, to my mind, make such initiatives futile endeavors. During the visit to base camp a few weeks ago, we talked to one of the base campers, that's what they call themselves, and she said that being involved in the work of base camp, that is imagining differently and together what anti-fascist living means today, made her feel empowered. And maybe that is actually also a kind of solution that these civil sequences can in fact arrive at, empowering people. Thanks for listening.